Hi, and welcome to this introduction to Limiter 6 Gentleman's Edition, a powerful dynamics toolkit from Tokyo Dawn Labs. Much more than just a limiter, it also provides a powerful soft or hard clipping module, a high-frequency limiter, and compression derived from the popular Molot compressor plugin. Modules can be dragged left or right to change the order of processing, or hidden entirely if you're not using them. While the metering section to the right displays true peak levels, plus EBU R128 loudness metering, so you can easily comply with modern broadcast standards. If you're feeling daunted by the options and want to keep it simple, try the minimal maximizer preset as starting point. I'll switch the loudness meter to show short-term levels, then crank the input level for the limiter module by turning up the drive knob. I can go crazy loud if I want to. But loud masters will just get turned down again automatically on streaming platforms. So these days it might be better to aim for more moderate levels around -12 LUFS. If you open the settings for the meter module, you can designate a target level, indicated by the triangles on the loudness meter. And you can also switch to relative mode if you prefer to designate your target level as 0. Even at these more moderate levels, however, we have a fundamental problem with this type of processing, in that when I toggle bypass, the volume changes significantly, making it impossible to assess the difference properly. Auto pad mode provides a neat solution to this. It turns down the plug-in output level, without affecting the level shown on the meters, so that the bypass signal can be equal loudness. And this allows us to hear exactly how our processing chain is changing the sound. The limiter itself is set to brick wall mode, so nothing really gets past the threshold. I'll turn this down to -1 to leave a little headroom for lossy data compression algorithms such as MP3 or AAC. If I right-click the peak meter and set it to true peak max mode, then click to reset it, I can verify that no intersample peaks are squeezing past. The limiter uses look ahead when in brick wall mode, and we have a choice of 3 settings. A longer look ahead might sound cleaner if you're hitting the limiter hard, and might soften transients a little. This is a good, transparent setting that might be all you need. But you can go further if you wish, and shape the sound in various ways. Let's turn off brick wall mode, and suddenly we see activity on the red output limiter. The output limiter is always at the end of the chain, unlike the other modules, and is intended as a final safety net. I'll make sure this is set to true peak mode so it catches intersample peaks, and I'll set the ceiling to give me my 1 dB of headroom. But it's usually better if this final limiter isn't pushed too hard, so I'll pull down the threshold of the peak limiter and dig a little deeper with that instead. The limiter release time is highly program dependent, but we can use the recovery knob to make it tend to faster times, which can work better with short, spiky transients. Or slower, which might handle low frequency content better, and might help to focus more attention on drums, as levels are held down slightly longer after each hit. We're running in full band mode at the moment, but sometimes switching to multi-band mode will work better, especially if there are loud events in a particular frequency band, such as a powerful kick drum or bass part. Multi-band mode splits the signal into 3 bands internally, with super gentle and transparent crossovers at 160 Hz and 6 kHz. Relative thresholds are handled behind the scenes, with complex and intelligent linking between bands. But we do gain an extra focus knob, which prioritizes low and high frequency transients when turned down, or mid-range transients when turned up. It's important to remember that multiband mode is not necessarily better. In this case, I like the way it controls the low end and glues the kick and bass. But the single band algorithm is just as complex, so there's little difference in CPU load when I switch. And full band mode can sometimes be better at preserving the original mix balance. We're now hitting the output limiter a bit harder than is ideal, however. So I'm going to unhide the clipper module and drag it after the peak limiter in the chain. I don't want any more gain, so I'll leave the drive at 0. But I'll switch to brick wall mode and set the threshold to -1 to leave my preferred 1 dB of headroom. And the clipper is now catching some of the peaks that squeeze past the peak limiter. Turning up the knee makes the clipping softer, so the added harmonics will sound warmer. But it will also make the clipping dig down further into the signal and happen more often. Smaller knee sizes will result in brighter, possibly harsher clipping. But this clipping will happen less frequently. If you're just catching very short transients, a harder knee setting might be more transparent. We can also use the separation knob to morph between full band clipping at 0 or multi-band clipping at 100%. Again using 3 bands internally and super gentle crossover filters that won't mess with the phase at all. Even with full separation, the clipper still does a good job of brick walling the signal, with just a few intersample peaks hitting the output limiter. Okay, I'm going to start from scratch now and take a slightly different approach, with the clipper before the limiter in the chain. And I'll drive the clipper input gain till we start to shave off the peaks a little. Pushing the clipper too far will result in obvious distortion, as that's literally what clipping is. But gently clipping short transients can be very transparent, and taming these transients before they hit the limiter can help to stop the limiter overreacting. Let's set the limiter threshold to provide a sensible ceiling, and push the gain the rest of the way to my target using the limiter drive knob. Of course, with the limiter in brick wall mode, I don't need brick wall behavior from the clipper, so I'm free to try the other options. The open type applies more clipping to higher frequencies, which can soften high transients and create a smoother sound. While the LF clipping mode focuses the clipping on the low frequencies, which is a great way to take control of deep, low bass lines such as this one. Clipping is instantaneous, so there's none of the pumping or breathing that might result from limiting. And the extra harmonics added by the clipping can help to give the bass part definition and make it a little more audible on small speakers that can't handle real low end. The separation knob makes a big difference to this effect. Limiter 6 provides a lot of flexibility in the way you set up your gain structure through the modules. In this case, I've balanced the added gain between the clipper and limiter modules. However, let's copy this setting to the B memory, then set the clipper drive back to 0, and turn the clipper threshold down by exactly the same amount. The clipper is now behaving exactly as it was, except the output level is 7 dB lower. So let's add that 7 dB to the limiter input instead. If I toggle back to the previous setting, we can hear that nothing has changed. But with the gain all added by the limiter, I can toggle bypass on the clipper without altering the overall gain. And I can easily assess the difference it makes to the limiting. Notice how much harder that bass part hits the limiter with the clipper off. So let's take a look at the high frequency limiter. This is the only module without a drive knob, as it's only concerned with the highest frequencies. Turn down the threshold to start catching and taming high-frequency peaks, like a dynamic high-shelf EQ, or just the highest band of a multiband limiter. You can tune the turnover frequency for the limiting, and can listen to just the affected frequencies if needed. The filter slopes are gentle and transparent, and you can get away with surprisingly large amounts of limiting before it becomes obvious. This is a great way to control rogue high-frequency events like loud cymbal hits, or to tame the high end for a warmer, more vintage-style presentation. Or, if your clipping occasionally tips into harshness, you can drag the high-frequency limiter after it in the chain to tame those higher harmonics. This module offers a more unusual relative mode, however. When I switch, the threshold knob disappears and is replaced with a range knob instead. In fact, the threshold is floating in this mode, determined by the overall signal level. So all we need to set is how much limiting we want. Relative mode therefore doesn't care about the input level. If I drag it after the limiter in the chain, it reacts in much the same way, despite the 10 dB level difference. And this means it will also follow the macro dynamics of your music, taming high-frequency events just as effectively in the quiet sections as in the loud parts. Okay, last but not least, let's take a look at the compressor module. Again, we have a drive knob to control the input level, and a threshold knob. And this time we also get to control ratio, and the attack and release times. 3 different compressor modes are available. Alpha mode is clean and transparent, and can glue mixes and add density or punch. Sigma mode will be familiar to users of the Mollet compressor, and has a lot more character. Especially if you hit it harder, as attack and release times depend on the amount of gain reduction applied in this mode. This setting is obviously now a bit heavy-handed for a mastering context. However, all modules provide a dry amount parameter, which allows you to blend in the dry signal for parallel processing. The dry signal includes the input gain added with the drive knob, and the gain reduction meters display the actual overall gain reduction. So if I set the dry amount to 100%, we won't see any activity at all. While a mix value of between 70 and 80% results in a gentle dB or 2 of parallel compression. The third, leveler compressor mode, features gentle hysteresis around the threshold, which helps to keep results sounding natural, even with higher ratio settings, like this instance here taming the dynamics of my voiceover. Notice that I've switched this instance to mono mode at the top, and as a consequence, the little buttons at the top right of each module are greyed out. Let's switch back to the stereo instance processing the music, and press the button at the top right of the compressor module to switch to mid-side mode, which allows us to manipulate the stereo image in various ways. The drive parameter shrinks in this mode and loses the knob, but still controls the overall level of the whole stereo image as it did before. But it's now joined by a width drive parameter, which controls the relative level of the side channel, which represents the difference between left and right. Turn down the width drive to reduce the differences between left and right and make the stereo image narrower. Or turn it up to increase the differences between channels and make the image wider. Likewise, the threshold parameter has lost its knob, but otherwise works the same as before, controlling the overall threshold for both mid and side channels. But mid-side mode uses independent, unlinked compression for the mid and side channels, so we also have a width threshold parameter, which sets the threshold for the side channel relative to the mid channel. When this is set to 0, it means the side channel threshold is the same as the mid-channel threshold. However, while setting the width drive to 0 results in no change in the stereo image, the width threshold works slightly differently, as real-world stereo signals almost always have lower signal levels for the side channel than for the mid-channel. Setting the side channel threshold the same as the mid-channel therefore results in more compression for the mid-channel than for the side, as we can see from the dual gain reduction meters. One of these isn't really moving at all. This means we've focused the compression on centrally panned elements, while the differences between left and right channels remain uncompressed. As the side channel usually contains a lot of the reverb and ambience in a mix, this can sometimes result in a more open sound with a greater sense of space and depth. Of course, it also means that the signal will get a bit wider overall. If it gets too wide, you could compensate with a little bit of negative width drive to narrow the signal back down again. Or if the stereo image only gets too wide in certain sections of the song, you could turn down the width threshold instead, and dynamically narrow the stereo image only when the side signal becomes too loud. All the main modules offer mid-side mode, which opens up some interesting possibilities. For example, I could widen the overall image using mid-side compression, but then use the high frequency limiter to dynamically reduce the width of the higher frequencies only. This can add a nice sense of space and depth, while keeping the high frequencies focused and centered. And if your short, peaky transients are mostly mono, consider switching the clipper module to mid-side mode. Leaving the width threshold at 0, so that mid and side thresholds are the same, will result in more clipping for the mid-channel than the side, which might help again to preserve the sense of space and depth. Before I leave you, I'm going to show you another slightly secret way to treat stereo signals. Alt-clicking the linking button will switch to Unlinked stereo mode, where left and right channels share the same settings but are processed independently. Unlinked compression can be considered technically wrong for stereo signals, as it can cause shifts in the stereo image. But of course, it only matters that it sounds good. Unlinked compression can sometimes sound better with loud, wide-panned elements, as it avoids any ducking of the opposite channel. And the subtle shifts in stereo image might help to add movement and interest to the mix. As always, your ears should be the judge.
My heart is too heavy to heat.
In a similar manner, I can unlink the limiter channels, but be aware that short-term limiting remains unlinked either way, so this will only affect slower changes. The clipper is always unlinked, however, so this option doesn't apply here. Limiter 6 prioritizes processing quality, and running it with all modules enabled will be comparable in processor load to a whole chain of equivalent plugins. If the CPU load gets too high, you can switch to Eco mode, which still provides processing comparable to the high-quality mode in many other plugins. Or if latency is an issue, you can switch to low latency mode. However, CPU use and latency won't be an issue in most mastering projects, so precise mode should be fine. Insane mode results in quite a large increase in CPU load, but don't expect to hear a similar increase in quality. In fact, the difference is likely to be inaudible in most cases. Finally, we can add 16-bit dither from this menu, with auto black so it turns itself off when the input is silent. And don't forget to turn off AutoPad before rendering. I'm going to leave you there. You can turn on Dynamic Help mode at the top right, and hover over controls if you need more information. Or you can open the user manual via the About box. Thanks for watching.